Alright, Wizard X220HV, this is your last chance. I always say that, but I've spent hours on this thing, and when I originally reviewed this guy, I got what they call death rolls, or they're commonly known as flips of death as well. And I thought it was down to the fact that the stock digital idle setting was 2.5, which is too low. So what that means is that the motors spin very slow at idle, and if you have got a high rate and you are using air mode, then sometimes when you put a roll in or a full pitch, then sometimes the motor will actually have to stop to meet that rate, and the flight controller can't react quick enough to it, and you get the death roll. So I upped the digital idle to about 8%, and I got around 6 flights with it. But I was flying it again, and I got another death roll, and this time it snapped an arm, but the GoPro was going, and I could hear tones coming from the ESC, and it was the last two tones, that duh, duh. And that is not the ESC board resetting, that is the ESC board regaining signal. So I had a few other problems, of course. I did modifications so that we got rid of the noise. So there was some noise coming through to the VTX, which was too much for me. That was caused by the XT60 running along the VTX here, and I've also added a 50-volt capacitor on there as well. Now the arm has turned up, and when I was thinking, why is this ESC losing signal? The pins that connect the flight controller to the ESC had a huge gap in them, and I just wondered whether the pins were coming detached or weren't connecting correctly, and then in a violent move that was causing the signal to be lost. So what I have done is I have cut down the standoffs so that the pins fit flush. You have to be careful though, because if you have soldered on the XT60 directly to the ESC, it does get very close to the SD card, but I've made sure and we are not touching there. Another concern that I had was the heat shrink around the motors. So what I did, I had to take all the motors off anyways to clean them. What I did was I unscrewed them all. It's a 2mm hex driver, and if you reverse the motor, get a pair of cutters, you can actually cut off that heat shrink, and you can see here where the motor was actually digging into the heat shrink, and the wires have got their own individual heat shrink anyways, and we have got a huge amount of clearance as well. So I thought maybe the motor was catching on this, causing some resistance and heating up the ESC. It might just be the case that the ESC has been damaged or is damaged, because there are videos out there that are saying this is the best thing since sliced bread, but for me it has been a bit of a nightmare. So hopefully this video will help some of you guys. It's quite worrying how easy the arm snapped as well, because I've had worse crashes and the arms didn't snap at all. Also, it's really difficult to replace an arm because we have got these nuts here and they are underneath the ESC board, and of course the ESC board is soldered to the motor wires, so we've got some hex screws there. They are really difficult to get to, so replacing an arm isn't easy either. But anyways, let's go and take this thing for a fly and see if any of this has made a difference.
It's the go. Oh, you thought I was going to look at that and go off, it's
I did not go off in the though, Pete.
I need better friends.
So that was one of my friends, quote unquote Pete, with his vape device, and I put the goggles on, and his idea was that I was to see magic smoke and think, oh man, this thing has died straight away. So thanks for that, Pete. But luckily, I lifted my goggles up to see if the GoPro was going, so I caught him out. Right, anyways, that's enough of that. This copter, just like the last video, there is some good news and some bad news. And I think I figured out why some people are giving this copter the best copter in the world review and nothing can beat it, and why I'm having problems. Now, first of all, I'll tell you why, despite the death roll, I don't think this is the best copter for the money. I think you can build a better copter than this. In fact, I'll put links in the description to the components of that. You'll have to build it yourself, but I think in the end you'll have a copter that is going to be reliable. So what do I mean by reliable? Well, when I was doing all of these fixes, I was having a lot of thoughts, and I thought, what is the common denominator here anytime I had these flips of death? And the answer every time was a violent maneuver. So you can fly around all day flying really smooth, and if you use the stock rates you'll never have a flip of death, and I will prove that because I've done so many flights just taking it easy. But put a violent maneuver in like I'm about to do in a second and you get the magic tones and it just goes into a flip of death. So there's something about this copter that doesn't like violent moves. I mean, just look at that. You might have been able to hear the tone. Luckily, nothing got broken and I was able to fly it again. I say nothing got broken, but I was getting some jitters on the next flight. So I think something got dislodged. Maybe it was a prop because I didn't switch the props out, or maybe a motor got bent or something like that. But the arm survived in that one. Now, I know there's going to be a ton of comments about, change the motor timing and change the motor startup speed. That, first of all, the motor startup speed is nothing to do with death rolls. All the motor startup speed is the jolt of power that is required to get the motors running. In fact, what you will find with some tiny whoops is they lower that figure to as low as possible, because what can happen is if it's too high and it's running off a 1S, then the board will brown out completely. And if that figure is too low, the motors actually might not spin, and sometimes you have to give them a little flick and then the motors will spin. So I know there's a video out there, there's a couple of videos out there saying the fix is to lower the motor startup speed. That is absolutely nothing to do with the flip of death roll or whatever. In fact, I would say with a bigger copter you need a higher startup speed because they're bigger motors. It's going to take a more jolt of power to get the motors spinning, and that's pretty much all that does. And I went through all of the settings before you start talking about that. So the medium high when it comes to motor timing, the temperature, none of that made any difference. The only thing that made a difference was not going violent with the sticks, which could be a couple of things. Either the ESCs can't handle the violent maneuvers, as in the back EMF, even with a capacitor on there, and something happens and it loses the signal, or those pins, even though I made them flush, maybe they just aren't tight enough and they need like soldering together or something, and they're still coming loose in violent maneuvers. But as you will see here, I'm doing a nice slow flight without any crazy maneuvers, and I can get a full flight every time. So if you've bought this model, what I will say is keep the rates low, don't do any violent maneuvers, and you won't get a flip of death. And that's probably why some people are saying this is the best thing since sliced bread, because they are not doing violent maneuvers like I like to do. I go with 1,000 degrees per second, which I always have done, and I like to mix it up. I like to do smooth maneuvers, but then I like to add the violent maneuver in there as well. It mixes it up a little bit, and every time I did the violent roll on the pitch or the roll, it did the flip of death. So I think that is my conclusion. It's something to do with the ESCs, whether it's the pins that aren't touching properly or the fact that the ESCs just cannot handle the back EMF when you do these violent maneuvers, and apparently Eachine are fixing it. But at the making of this video, I cannot recommend this copter, and as I say, I'm going to put some links in the below, because I think you can build a better copter with better components. And when I'm flying this copter, I don't feel safe. You'll notice I'm flying just over grass here, because I don't feel comfortable flying over concrete or even near our group of people that are flying in case it goes crazy. So that is my conclusion with this copter, and I hope you found it useful. Just take it easy and maybe lower the rates, and maybe on 6S you'll have a good time with it. By the way, for the people that haven't seen the other videos, and it's really tricky because, you know, I cover this stuff in multiple videos and then I get the same comments again. I know there's going to be a comment about maybe it's the flight controller browning out, but it's not that, because when the flight controller browns out, then it resets the on-screen display. You get the Betaflight logo coming up. It is not that. It is something to do with the ESC. So, you know, this has taken up so many hours of my time, and I don't make any money from it. So if you can afford to do so, I'll link to my Patreon in the below. And as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.